Is 6v6 better for Overwatch 2? Let's find out. Comparing both formats, they're actually very similar, but having one extra player allows team comps to be more diverse. So many different strategies like the dive, goats, triple barrier, or triple DPS comps, just to name a few, took full advantage of having 6-player teams and free role choice. 6v6 undeniably makes each team fight more chaotic due to the 12 potential ultimates that can all go off at once. It also feels like the fights are quicker and have less stalling as the amount of DPS easily compounds on each other, but the opposite can be said if the comp is more tank or healing focused. And on bigger maps like Hollywood, the extra player helps to make it feel much less emptier, while on smaller maps like Volskaya, it does overcrowd the checkpoints. In theory, 6v6 should benefit DPS the most as it allows them to get away with being a bit stronger, while tanks can't have too much health, like in the case with D.Va, having her health nerfed back to 600 in Overwatch 1, as they still have another beefy tank on their team. But the balancing of the game definitely did not make this the case. Now, it's easy to look back at 6v6 and say, yeah, it was a lot worse because it brought team comps like the GOATS comp, which didn't have any DPS, only 3 healers and tanks, and was one of the most boring and dragged out team strategies ever. The theme of 6v6 seemed to be it's just overkill in whatever your team comps specified in, that being DPS, shielding, or healing respectively, which for a time was killing the competitive scene, especially when GOATS lasted around 2 years. But I think it's a big misunderstanding that those comps are a direct product of having 6v6, but I'll explain specifically what I mean later on in the video. So to fix this, Blizzard introduced the role queue. No longer could you compound your damage or healing, rather it was 2 of every role. And although in theory this makes the game more fair and balanced, and technically it did because you can't abuse the multitude of broken tanks in the game, but it also had the opposite effect and killed the game so much that players didn't want it anymore entirely. Why and what was this adverse effect? Well, this ties into 5v5 and how it actually benefits the game. But first, comparing it to 6v6, 5v5 makes each match less chaotic and unpredictable, especially for characters that rely on more team synergies like McCree, who on his own will probably benefit with less people running around him in a fight since he can't really escape situations quickly, unlike Tracer for example. Having a maximum of only 10 potential ults happening at once is also a great thing, but in turn it does make the game's pacing feel slower, as well as making smaller maps feel just right and the bigger maps emptier. It also allows tanks to be stronger overall and feel more like an actual tank. They can get away with more health and armor because in role queue, they alone as the solo tank are meant to aggro most of the damage. Speaking of which, the biggest benefit by far of 5v5 is how much faster it makes role queue wait times. Back when it first came out in Overwatch 1, we would sometimes have to wait over an hour for DPS roles and heck even 20 minutes for tank or healer, and that's just for one game. There was a time where I didn't even bother doing my placements for DPS since the queues were too long, but in Overwatch 2, having only one tank, which is the least desired role, and 2 DPS and healers makes this process a lot less tedious. As well as the game's player base being a lot more popular than back in 2019 when they first introduced the system as mandatory. But I guess that's why they added the open queue option as a failsafe anyways. So does all of this mean 5v5 is actually more balanced than 6v6? Well, this is another misunderstanding. It's unfair to say this because the game's balancing is completely different now. Overwatch 1 was plagued with stun lock abilities like Doomfist's Punch or Maze Freeze, ability cancelling like Sombra's 5-second hack time, as well as an insane amount of buffs to tanks and their barriers/shields in an attempt to get players playing them more. Then add all those bad decisions and you get this character, which ultimately damaged Overwatch's core gameplay. Had Blizzard not just buffed poorly designed characters and classes that weren't being used, rather give them actual reworks like they did in Overwatch 2, I think much of the terrible team comps we saw wouldn't have come to fruition. So is 5v5 better than 6v6? Well, although I do prefer 6v6 better as it just adds an extra layer of intensity to each game, 5v5 is easier to balance and allows each role to individually feel more important to the team. But I do think 6v6 deserves another chance with the current balancing of Overwatch 2 in some way, shape or form. Though this is just one new change that Overwatch 2 brought, which begs the question, is Overwatch 2 better than Overwatch 1? You can find that out in the video and the end card.